afternoon, good morning, colleagues, and good afternoon to those who may be joining us online from a different time zone. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and we do very much welcome your participation. So we're going to get started with the adaptation priorities in the Indo-Pacific and Africa region, co-design knowledge and solutions side event, which is being co-hosted by the University of Melbourne, Melbourne Climate Futures, and the International Universities Climate Alliance. It's a very, very active day, as you can imagine, second week of the COP, and many issues have been moved over to this week in the hope that we could have a very successful outcome for COP27. And one of the big issues on that, on the agenda, of course, is adaptation. And so it is a great privilege to be able to host a number of very important experts who can give us insight into what those priorities from different regions that they represent, and what those priorities are, and how exactly the COP and academia can support countries achieving those priorities. So as I mentioned, we will be exploring adaptation needs, priorities, and options in the different regions. We aim to highlight the importance of adaptation and just transition, the dangers of loss and damage, and the urgent need to increase action and support for both, including through co-design hubs. Kathryn, may I turn the floor over to you?
Thank you very much, Janine, and my welcome to you all watching here at the venue and online. So it's my pleasure to introduce our four panellists for this session. We have a wonderful collection of specialists working on adaptation and climate change that are here to speak today on this session. So what I will do is I'll provide a bit of background on each of our speakers, and then we'll pass to each speaker for 5 minutes and hear their reflections on adaptation needs and priorities in the particular context they're working within. And then we will have quite a bit of time for Q&A from the audience, and also hopefully via our online audience, but I'm not quite sure whether the tech is up to that, so we'll just have to see. So firstly, I would like to introduce Aromar Revi. Down the end here is the director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, which is India's prospective institution of eminence and interdisciplinary national university focused on urbanisation. And over a dozen years, Aro has built IIHS into one of the world's leading education, research, training, advisory and implementation support institutions, focusing on the multi-dimensional challenges and opportunities of sustainable urbanisation. And you might have already seen Aro as part of the launch of the Urban Summary for Policymakers report that came out of Working Group 2 of the IPCC last week. So Aro really is a global practice and thought leader and educator with over 35 years of interdisciplinary experience in sustainable development, public policy and governance, human settlements, global environmental and technological change. So Aro is also co-chair of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a vital network that really led the successful global campaign for an urban sustainable development goal, SDG 11, as part of the UN's 2030 development agenda. So thank you, Aro. I'll now introduce Kathy. Kathy is a Marshall Islander poet. So Kathy, do you want to raise your, yeah. Kathy is a Marshall Islander poet, performance artist and educator. She received international acclaim through her poetry performance at the opening of the UN Climate Summit in New York in 2014. That's incredible. Her writing and performances have been featured by CNN, Democracy Now!, The Huffington Post, NBC News, National Geographic and more. In February 2017, the University of Arizona Press published her first collection of poetry, and you might have to pronounce this for me, Kathy. Jaltok. Oh, I got it. All right, excellent. Poems from a Marshallese Daughter. Kathy also co-founded the youth environmentalist non-profit Jikum, dedicated to empowering Marshallese youth to seek solutions to climate change and other environmental impacts threatening their home island. Kathy has been selected as one of 13 climate warriors by Vogue in 2015 and the Impact Hero of the Year by Earth Company in 2016. She received her Master's in Pacific Island Studies from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So welcome very much, Kathy. Jessica, in the colourful pink here, is a research fellow on inclusive net zero for the Oxford Net Zero Initiative and is based at the Institute of Science, Innovation and Technology. Her research critically examines whether and how the net zero concept enables greater equity and justice in climate action by state and non-state actors in emerging economies and developing countries. Prior to joining the University of Oxford, she was a research associate at the University of York, working on climate financing of climate change adaptation in developing countries. She's also previously worked at the Green Climate Fund, which is, as we know, an international climate finance institution. She's also worked in NGOs such as Mercy Corps and Care International in Sub-Saharan Africa, where she led development and resilience programs in the region. She holds a PhD in climate justice and climate finance from the University of Reading, a Master of Science in climate change and development from the University of Sussex, and a Bachelor of Science in meteorology from the University of Nairobi. So, welcome. Welcome, Jessica. And finally, Yvonne. Yvonne Githiora is a PhD candidate at the University of Nairobi Institute for Climate Change and Adaptation in Kenya. She's previously worked in both the public and non-governmental sector on projects ranging from public policy to climate change mainstreaming and water and ecosystems research. Yvonne is passionate about making a positive impact on environmental, societal and education issues in Africa. Yvonne's research focuses on the link between communities and ecosystems and how scientific information can be used to inform development, planning and processes. As a trained ecologist, Yvonne's thesis investigates the impacts of changes in land use and climate on ecosystem services delivery in the Yala wetland in Western Kenya. So I think you can see from my introductions, we have an esteemed panel bringing a diverse range of experiences, specialties and background, and I think this will really provide for a rich panel discussion. So I will start with Yvonne, if I could invite you to present your brief input into the adaptation needs and priorities from your perspective. Thanks, Yvonne.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathryn, for that introduction. As she mentioned, my name is Yvonne Githiora from the University of Nairobi. So I'll be speaking a little bit about some of the adaptation needs and priorities in Africa, but specifically related to research. So some of the challenges that we are facing as African institutions of higher learning that are dealing with climate change. So just a bit on some of the broader adaptation priorities and needs for Africa. We know that, for example, Africa is rapidly urbanizing, but much of this urbanization is unplanned. So a lot of poorly planned informal settlements coming up. I think something like 60% of Africa's population now lives in informal settlements. So that's really a major issue going forward, considering that urbanization will continue to increase in future. So how can we future-proof African cities, make them sustainable, make them work for the people, promote well-being, have urban green spaces, have ways to deal with waste management, have ways to move people across these cities that are carbon neutral, for example, maybe light rail systems and so on. Africa also has some unique adaptation needs in terms of agriculture and livelihoods. We rely on agriculture for our life support, and it really supports the livelihoods of a huge proportion of Africans. So there's really need to look at the agricultural sector as well. how we can manage our water, how we can work with the local communities that work directly in agriculture or rely on the natural resources for their livelihoods. So in terms of the specific needs of African institutions of higher learning, I've mainly been involved in research, and we are doing work on some of the adaptation needs across sectors in Africa. But we are facing a lot of funding constraints. So for example, only 3.8% of climate change funding has actually, adaptation funding has actually gone to African countries. And of this, only about 1% has gone to the universities. And you can compare this with about 79% of funding that goes to North America and Europe in terms of climate change research. So there's really a need to support African universities to be able to do the research on what is happening locally, because Africa is such a diverse continent. The ecosystems are very different. The socioeconomic backgrounds are different across the continent. So there's really a need to do a lot of local level research to see what is actually needed on the ground for the specific ecosystems and communities in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting. I think the information on challenges for the university sector in Africa, I didn't realise that the funding to universities in Africa is so low, 1% of the adaptation funding. So, yes. Jessica, would you like to go next?
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica, and I was thinking about adaptation this morning. So I think I had 2 points, actually, and one was in alignment with the theme of the COP, implementation. The second one was finance, because I've been talking about finance for a long time, and I still think it is a very relevant topic. It's a really relevant need. And then Yvonne brought in research funding, which I'd also like to add on. And so 3 things in 5 minutes. I'll try to be quick. So there is a huge implementation gap, particularly in developing countries. There is a database by the Grantham Institute on climate change laws of the world, or something like that. I use that quite a lot, but I never capture the title of the database. It shows you what different policies countries have. You'll be surprised how many climate change policies countries have. They've developed a lot. And some of those stretch from as early as the 1990s. They're kind of iterations of the same improvements. Some of them are new. These countries have climate change bills, strategies, policies. They have action plans. And all of those are just policies. But then what we realize is that there's a very huge implementation gap. And so, it's easier to develop a policy. You say that you're doing it bottom-up, stakeholder engagement. The UNFCCC asks countries to submit policies every year. You have to do national communications, you have to do NAPs, revise NAPs, update your NDCs. There's technology needs and all those. So there's policies are there, but then they're just translating those policies into action is probably the biggest challenge for these countries. And the underlying drivers for the policy implementation gap, it's quite a lot. One of them is technical capacity. Another thing is just human capacity to do that. Another issue is financing. Another issue is just the general policy direction, because if you're constantly being asked to develop policies without actually being given time to implement them and learn from them, there's really no incentive for you to do that. And so I think one of the priorities for developing country is implementation, and this COP actually highlights that. And I think starting about 12 months ago, we knew that this COP would be an implementation COP. And so I'm really eager to see what comes out of this, what concrete steps are identified for transforming adaptation plans, policies, strategies into actual implementation in developing countries. The second one, managed to do that in 3 minutes. Second one is finance. As I said, to actually, we need we need policies. Policies do take money, but at least in my opinion, my professional opinion, it's much cheaper to develop a policy, because you get your experts sitting down, you consult a few people or many people, you have a policy, but the implementation bit is the hardest bit, and that requires a lot of resources. That is not there. We've done some work. I've done some work with a team that found that developing countries are already investing in adaptation through their development plans, everyday development plans. Even during COVID, you saw countries investing their public budgets into adaptation. But even then, that financing is not enough. There's a report that was released by CPI quite recently. So I think sometime this year, it's at the 2021 or 2022 report on the climate finance landscape for Africa, that says that even though the NDCs of African countries indicate that they'll need about 500 billion for adaptation, that's probably about less than 50% of the costed needs. And so the NDCs of African countries, they vary from very detailed to some countries do not provide much detail for various reasons, but then very few of those needs that are identified in NDCs are actually costed. The drivers are, there's just no technical capacity in countries to actually cost those needs. For example, if you're a small country, you have the competing priorities. You have to develop a policy, you have to develop an NDC very rapidly, and so you may lack that technical financial capacity to accurately and comprehensively cost your needs. And so as much as we think that the adaptation financing needs are huge right now, they're much bigger, because if we were to go to each country and actually cost it from the bottom up and think about what do households need, or what do counties need and what do countries actually need, then the needs would be much higher. I remember, I think was it at last year during the ministerial consultations before COP26, African governments quoted about, was it between 1 and 3 trillion needed for adaptation by 2030. And so addressing that financing gap will be really important, because it determines where we are in 2030, and where we are in 2030 determines whether we have a chance of reaching 1.5 by 2050. And so that is the financing gap. And my point there is that we need accurate costings of finance and actually finding ways to mobilize that finance. And then just kind of jumping on to what Yvonne said about research funding. I do agree, definitely, yes. So there's a very huge imbalance in how research funding is allocated. There's very little global South-led or developing country-led research. I'm a developing country person, but I am based in the global North. But you kind of see the imbalances, how those happen. There's like, part of my funding comes from UKRI, and UKRI is very much dedicated to ensuring that whatever research it funds is collaborative, it works with Global South researchers, but even then that is not sufficient to ensure that this research is Global South-led. One thing that is important for Global South-led research is that if a person from Egypt develops research, an Egyptian develops their own research here, then an Egyptian is more likely to take that paper or policy brief to their government, to their private sector, and tell them, we did this based off of a meeting we had 3 months ago, and this is what I know you need, and this is how you can address your own problems. And so local, Global South-led research has more likelihood of generating impact, both in the public and private sphere. But I think that creating Global South research is not strictly something that should be done from the global North. I think we need to change the paradigm in a way that Global South research is funded by Global South governments or Global South institutions. At least we need institutions in the Global South begin to fund research. We need governments to see the value of research that is produced locally. We need them to start providing that resources to do that. And that kind of starts creating power frameworks where a Global South researcher has much more bargaining power when they're dealing with a Global North researcher. It's much easier for a Global South researcher to have more control over what research does, what impact it generates. But to get there, we need a population that understands the importance of research. We need research that is produced here to be used locally. We need the media to refer to research when they are communicating their fundings. For example, we talk about a politician promised to construct a railway between, within the first 100 days of office. we need a media article to say that, there was research done by a researcher from the University of Nairobi that says that constructing a railway costs X number of billions, and apparently this politician does not know where they'll get that money. And so we need very critical engagement that actually engages with the research that is produced in the Global South. And so we see these three spaces where Global South research requires local funding, at least at the beginning, so that it evens out the power differentials. But also we need consumption for local-bred research, at least for adaptation and broader climate change. Sorry, I went on for a while.
No, they're wonderful reflections, Jessica, and I think, yes, you've got some claps in the audience, and I do think that, as you say, you articulated very clearly those issues around demand and supply in terms of local research and the importance of locally owned research if there's going to be any implementation of good policies that reflect the knowledge base. So wonderful to hear those perspectives. And so now we'll hear from Kathy.
Thank you. So I actually that really resonates me, what you were just saying about locally led research for solutions for adaptation and how important that is, because I know that for us in the Marshall Islands, we have a really specific situation, and I guess I'll be speaking directly from that experience. In my capacity as climate envoy, a lot of our work has been focused on developing our national adaptation plan. We have a particular vulnerability as a nation, the Marshall Islands, in that we're only 2 meters above sea level. As a SIDS, we're an atoll nation. There's no higher ground. And so adaptation is such a key and important part of maintaining our sovereignty and our ability to retain our status as a state. And so we're looking at some really large-scale forms of adaptation that includes land elevation, land reclamation, seawalls and revetments. And while we're looking at those land reclamation, you're talking about relocating communities so that you can elevate that land. And there's 24 atolls in our islands, and each of those have their own unique ecosystem, their own unique kind of culture. Many Marshallese people don't call themselves Marshallese. They'll say they're from that specific island. Like I say, I'm Ridelewe, Riaor, and so, I think we have to be really careful in our adaptation process, and it's a lot of pressure to really figure out what is going to be the right adaptation pathway forward. And these are also very expensive adaptation pathways. Land reclamation, land elevation, that's not cheap at all. We're looking at costings of up to, it's $1 billion per atoll, and there's 24. Yeah, and that's quite difficult to get the finance, because it's really unfortunate that the way that people look at it is there's no return on the investment in maintaining sovereignty. Although for us, you can't put a cost, there's no price tag for our independence in our nation. So it's quite difficult, but I think that's what we're trying to push, is to scale up financing for adaptation and to ensure that people see how important it is. It's not just mitigation at this stage. I think a lot of times people look at mitigation and it's always, it's one pathway forward, but it needs to happen in parallel as well as with loss and damage. And so I think that's some of what we're looking at. And with the National Adaptation Plan, we're going to be, there's a big component of it called the community consultations, where we actually go out into each of those atolls and get perspectives from communities about what they want to see, what kind of adaptation pathway they would prefer. Would they prefer to relocate permanently from their island, or would they prefer land elevation, which would require a temporary relocation? One of the first atolls we've gone to, our youth who conducted the youth consultation, from our nonprofit, we actually had youth conducting youth consultations with other youth to get their perspectives on what adaptation pathway they would like to see. It was really interesting. They actually said they would prefer to stay, whereas the elders preferred to relocate. And so that's really where we're thinking about is it's such a, just being careful about how we choose which adaptation pathway, and being really conscious that also we're working at a limited time. And so it's quite difficult for us as a nation, but we're also working within the Glasgow, sorry to shift a little bit. in terms of what's happening, that's all at the national scale. That's a lot of our focus, at home, and that's a lot of my work lately just focusing on that, on the development of that NAP. But here and at the COP, we're working within the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh Work Program to elaborate on what the global goal in adaptation should be, and it's really about ensuring that that they're not furthering reporting standards for, that it doesn't trickle down to hurting small nations like ours with limited capacity who already have a huge scale to climb in terms of adaptation. We're looking at how that we believe that academic analysis on how the goal could be structured may be useful, as well as input on how to assess progress towards achieving the goal, including on appropriate indicators. So I also want to note that a lot of SIDS haven't been able to complete their NAPs and their adaptation communications. There's a lot of push to try to ensure that more and more NAPs and adaptation communication comes in. Those kinds of reporting, I think, are really valuable for really assessing where countries are and then where the financing is necessary. So RMI was one of the first SIDS to actually submit an adaptation communication, but there's a need for systems to be integrated to enable those to be developed in a more routine and robust way. So for this, scaled up support, both financial and technical, are gonna need to be challenged. I think there is a lot of science on adaptation, and there's a lot of science on atolls, but none of it is reaching us. And I think that's where it's really unfair. Where and what I like to say is the adaptation challenge for the RMI feels like we're learning how to build a boat while it's sinking. It's because, and I used to say it's like building a boat, but we don't even know how to build a boat. We're actually learning how to build the boat while it's against the clock. So I think that's kind of just some initial thoughts on these priorities that for countries like ours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Another round of applause. And we can tell you're a poet because the way you articulate your insights and your experience is so clear. I think, a couple of the points, adaptation is key to maintaining our sovereignty. That is a fundamental point you just shared, and I think that's incredibly powerful. But also your comment around there being a lot of pressure to figure out the right adaptation pathway. And we don't often think about that pressure that we feel in terms of adaptation solutions and the trade-offs. And so that's a really important point that hopefully we will also be able to unpack in the discussion. So shifting regions again then, we've heard from Africa, we've heard from the Pacific, and now if we're shifting over to India, although Aro, I'm sure you'll give us a global perspective as well, but please welcome your thoughts.
Thanks very much. You've really set a very large canvas. I mean, if you look back 250 years, the Indo-Pacific, or I would say the Indian Ocean littoral, produced 55% of global output. That's in the late 18th century. And then we had various forms of colonization and exciting things happening, including a lot of world wars. It went down to less than 10%. In fact, it went down to 5% at one point of time. At the current point of time, a third of global output comes from this region. So I think the first thing that we have to understand is that the geography of global economies, populations, risk adaptation has dramatically shifted. A lot of climate science, and I'm a climate scientist, I co-led the 1.5 implementation report, the synthesis report is now just coming up, etc. The challenge is that we don't recognize this dramatic shift, and it's going to be even more dramatic over the next 20 years. Right? India's just crossed China as the largest population in the world, 1.4 billion people. If you add up South Asia plus China, that's about a third of the world population. If you add all of the Indo-Pacific, it's about half of the world population. So we must understand the geographies have dramatically changed, and the dynamics of climate risk and hence adaptation are fundamentally different. So our tipping points are very critical. The monsoon connects 2 billion people. If something happens to the monsoon, all the way from East Africa, right across Asia, into northern Australia, across the Pacific, we're all in dramatic challenge. Food security, poverty, the works as far as that's concerned. Antarctica sits towards the south, another critical tipping point, which will change everything else. Towards the north, depending on how you look at it, you have the Himalayan sort of third pole. So just in terms of climate drivers, many of the critical things that are outside Greenland and Amazonia, which are very important, sit in this region. So there's both responsibility and considerable risk as far as this is concerned. And the reason that I would say that the Indo-Pacific is very important, not only because of population, because of economic output, which creates its own challenges, is that we have the largest concentration of vulnerable people. We have vulnerable people, of course, most critically vulnerable in our small island states, whether it's in the Pacific or the Indian Ocean. We know the challenges that we're currently dealing with. We saw that during the Indian Ocean tsunami, fine? If there was an experiment to see how things would actually happen, the tsunami gave us a very good example of that. We also have the largest concentration of poor people, fine? Almost 2/3 of the poorest people in the world live across sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia, the Pacific, Southeast Asia in this sense. So in a sense, if there's one thing that connects us in terms of adaptation priorities, it is vulnerability. So vulnerability reduction, lifting the floor in terms of access to basic services, lifting the floor in terms of resilience, is the most important common thing that we're talking about. So we have to end poverty, and poverty is endemic, absolute or real poverty. We have to ensure food security, and that's a very serious challenge. We've seen just now, with just a constraint in the food supply coming from Ukraine, the challenges that we're seeing in Africa, in many parts of Asia. There's regime change taking place as far as that's concerned. So dealing with SDG 2 is absolutely critical as far as we're concerned. We have to deal with questions of water. Water is a thing that connects all of us in some senses. And we know from the science of this year that the global planetary boundary on water has just been breached. So it's not only local crisis of too little water in Sahel, too much water. We've seen Pakistan just now. Before that, it was South Africa, etc. But the fact is that if the global hydrological cycle is impacted, and it's starting to show in many parts of the world, then the Indo-Pacific, and Australia in some senses is the most vulnerable country, is at dire risk. Fine. But having said that, I think we often make a mistake, because those of us who work on adaptation, and I've done that for a fairly long time, often forget that adaptation cannot be looked at in isolation from development. Adaptation is actually the effective delivery of sustainable development, whether it's poverty reduction, whether it's basic services, in water, in energy. If you're not dealing with water poverty, energy poverty, you're not doing very much as far as it's concerned. If you're not dealing with inequality at the structural level, especially gender inequality, you're not doing very much to deal with adaptation. So adaptation sits in a context. If our development is messed up, then adaptation can't happen. If you actually are able to sort of implement, operationalize sustainable development as it was promised when we negotiated the SDGs in 2015, that is, leaving no one behind, leaving no place behind, because spatial inequality is very critical in this region, and leaving no ecosystem behind. In effect, you have actually dealt with the base challenge of adaptation, because in some cases, like in the SIDS, like in many other parts of Asia and Africa, which are exposed to a whole range of hazards, exposure is something that you cannot control. You know, the Netherlands can do something, and in some senses, the SIDS are really struggling to try and use hard measures to control adaptation. But we know that there are limits, and in those limited environments, as far as that's concerned, the thing that you can deal with is vulnerability reduction and building capacities to respond to these kind of processes. And I know that. I've helped build and execute programs that involve tens of millions of people, not just, you know, whatever, 100,000 or 200,000, etc., where you're doing vulnerability reduction. So the connection between adaptation and development is central. And as far as most people in many countries are concerned, that connection is very important. The other thing, and I said this on Friday, was the most effective form of adaptation is actually mitigation. So we have to prepare to mitigate, to hold things below 1.5. Otherwise, we're in a desperate problem. We know that, we've said that, you know, from the science side for a long period of time. But you have to prepare, given the commitments that we've had in the previous COPs and where we are just now on emissions, we have to prepare for adaptation that takes you to 2.8 and above. You have to do both things simultaneously. This seems kind of crazy, but the fact is, when you look at the solution space, and we've helped map that, we've looked at about 50, 60 adaptation and mitigation options together. The story is interesting. Solutions exist, they're feasible, And they're solutions that actually don't have significant trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation, especially in the green and blue space, which is very important for us in some senses. The challenge for us is to do them simultaneously. There is a discourse that's been around the climate space, and I've seen this since Rio almost 30 years ago, that is that you have to trade off first environment and development. That's actually, that's wrong. The second thing is you can do mitigation first and do adaptation later. We've lost the 30 years. We have to do all of them together. And that, I think, is a really dramatic challenge. And I think we have examples. China has done this at scale in many cases. It struggles in many places and sizes. There are lots of examples of trying to do this together. So we have to do 5 things together. The energy transition, which is actually working and moving. But most critically for this region, we have to implement the ecosystem, land ecosystems and water systems transition. Because if we do not have food security, if we do not have water security, most of us are going to be in very dire crisis at both the personal and other level. And then, because this is the most rapidly urbanizing region, much of the cities are to be built in Africa and Asia, we have a lot of opportunities there. The only way to save ourselves and save the planet in some senses is to focus very critically on the urban transition and the infrastructure transition. And to make sure, because most of this will happen in informal settlements, that we actually, like I said, reduce vulnerability, increase our ability to deliver equitable services across all people as far as that's concerned. So these 3 things are going to be absolutely critical, because the other 2 transitions, the one on industry is not going very well and it's going to be challenging, and the societal one, which is very important post-COVID, of bringing together citizens, civil society organizations, universities, and this has been done in some places but not enough, along with local governments and national governments, is the critical element that's going to enable us to scale this process. We have 20 years to make this happen. Climate change is not about something that's going to happen to somebody else and at some other time. It's happening, it's real, it's active, and like we're seeing across much of our region, it's going to really impact our existence dramatically. I mean, we could have hundreds of millions of climate refugees, both internally displaced and across borders in this region. And that, I think, is one of the most dramatic challenges to human security, dignity, and conflict, which is, if we don't succeed in what we're doing, something that's about to start happening. So thank you so much.
That more clapping for Arrow. Absolutely, you've provided a very thoughtful perspective there, and I think particularly for me, working in the health sector, and I realise Janine and I haven't provided our introductions, which we'll do in a minute, but your reflections around the food system, the water system, these are all the determinants of healthy populations. So we know that climate change will amplify the current issues that communities are facing in terms of many different determinants of health. So yes, we should briefly introduce ourselves, Janine. So I'm Kathryn Bowen. I'm from the University of Melbourne, where I'm one of the Deputy Directors of Melbourne Climate Futures and also Professor of Climate, Environment and Global Health at the university. I was a lead author of Working Group 2, the Human Health chapter of the 6th Assessment Report. And so, yes, I've worked in the Indo-Pacific region for the last 2 decades, particularly on health and climate change issues. So over to you, Janine, and then we'll open up for the discussion.
Thank you very much. My name is Janine Felson. I'm currently working at the Melbourne Climate Futures as an Enterprise Fellow, but I'm also an ambassador of Belize, a small island developing state as well, and worked for 20 years with small island developing states in various capacities on various issues, including on sustainable development agenda, and of course on climate change, and currently even support them on climate finance. So it's a pleasure to have heard all of these interventions. I'm very keen to get into the conversation as well. Thank you.
I think we're quite fortunate to have everyone here, because otherwise they'd be pulled into negotiations of various types. So let's take this opportunity while we have this incredible panel to ask any questions of the panellists here today. So please, there should be a mic, a roving mic for any questions. We can open the floor now. put your hand up if you'd like to ask anything. And well, while we're waiting for you to... oh, there's a question down the front, please. He's stuck in his box. He can't share the mic. We won't be able to hear you. Can someone please help with the mic? Thank you very much. I think it's coming. And maybe introduce yourself if you wouldn't mind.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. I am Hannah Staley. I'm with the Indiana University delegation from Indiana in America. And I was just wondering, so for the Marshall Islands and small island developing states, you mentioned that populations would need to relocate when you do build seawalls and elevate the land. And so I was just wondering if you could foresee any loss and damages in that process with small island developing states, and how maybe that could be compensated, or even just any plans for it.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually why we also prioritize, in addition to adaptation, Marshall Islands also prioritizes loss and damage. And I actually think I've been trying to highlight that there's a really unique link between adaptation and loss and damage in the Marshalls, specifically because of what you just said. You know, when communities are being relocated more inland or to another atoll, they are losing their economic means of support. You know, a lot of them are weavers who would normally use the pandanus trees that are there and is a source of income. It's one of the main sources of income in the outer islands for a lot of Marshallese women to support their families. They'll lose access to those trees for their weaving, or if you build a seawall and it ruins the shoreline, or it somehow impacts the reef, then the fishermen won't be able to make the economic means of support. But then you're also talking about cultural knowledge that's going to be lost, because with our culture, it's very deeply tied to land. And so we have specific coral reefs, specific groves of trees that have a legend or a story behind it, and that gets lost when you change the shape of the land. And so for us, that all encompasses loss and damage. And it's really interesting that we are forced to adapt, we have to adapt, and that in turn creates loss and damage for us. And so I think there's some opportunities for us. We've looked at, when they've said, okay, well, how would you want to use loss and damage funds? What are some of your initial thoughts? Some of what we suggested have been cultural preservation, finding some way of marking those legends, collecting that knowledge, turning it into curriculum, creating museums, creating spaces for that. And I think because it's such an important part of our identity that we don't want that part to be lost too. And so I think that's a part of it too. And then of course, paying for that relocation, those costs, and paying for also the loss of economic means and things like that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. And we have another question, please.
Hi, I'm Ritika Suri from the Wellcome Trust based in the UK. So we're a global health funder and are just thinking about our climate and health strategy, particularly in the area of adaptation. And a key priority for us is that we're doing research that will, for the communities most affected by climate change. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what research priorities we should be thinking about in the areas where we're focusing on today.
Who would like to start with that?
Okay, just very quickly, the most recent and most obvious thing is heat, fine? But it's not only heat, it's heat at high wet bulb temperatures. You just add the population in low elevation coastal zones that are exposed to that, and you have hundreds of millions of people. So they're most directly exposed to heat. That's proximate, it's happening. We've seen the waves pretty much across the world. The second thing, which is underrated in some senses, is the implication on wash. Fine? Too much water, too little water, too many places underwater for too long? This is an old question. It's sort of dropped in the global burden of disease kind of rankings. I can tell you as we approach 1.5 and breach that, that's going to come back in a significant way. So it's an old story, we know the answers, but in a different context as far as that's concerned. The third thing is going to be a whole range of new diseases that emerge because of changes in temperature, edaphic conditions, etc. as far as that's concerned. Some of them will be zoonotic, some of them will be others as far as that's concerned. But in the background of that is a serious crisis that's going to emerge or build on, which is dual burden. So nutrition at one end, and the second thing is a whole range of new things that are coming on, which is lifestyle diseases in informal settlements where you're dealing with diabetes, hypertension, etc., with people who are extremely poor and almost no effective health services. So I've just touched on 3 or 4 critical ones that are there, which are obviously tied to climate drivers, but you know, we have a lot of evidence. Look at the health chapter in AR6, and you have both nasty things and a lot of interesting solutions.
Yeah, thanks, Aro. That's a great overview. I don't want to take time from the panellists to respond to your question, but thank you very much for your interest, and I know the Wellcome Trust is passionate about this area. One thing just to add is that it's our basic health systems that need strengthening, with an understanding of the projections of climate change and how that will alter our burdens of disease. So if we look at different parts of the world, if we take the Pacific, for example, it's non-communicable diseases that are really the highest burden of disease. However, we still see a conversation happening in the Pacific by some governments in particular that are focused particularly on infectious diseases. So we really need to work more closely together with other governments in the region to explain that actually the burden currently will be exacerbated by food and water security issues and having to rely a lot more on processed foods and so on. And so and then the other point I'd just say is that there's an absolute urgent need for the conduct of vulnerability and capacity assessments in the region. So these are not up to date, they're not regularly conducted, there's no funding to do them in a consistent manner. And, you know, picking up one of the earlier points around just having the people to be able to do those assessments as well. And so it takes a large amount of capacity strengthening. So there's a few points from me too, but I think we've also got some reflections from Yvonne and Jessica perhaps.
My answer doesn't answer your question, but if you're looking to do research that benefits those who are most vulnerable, then I really cannot tell you what priorities are, because I know a health agenda for Chad is very different from a health agenda for Namibia. The best way to do this is to put the researchers in those countries in a leadership role. I think what we need is inclusive research, and inclusive research is saying that we want to fund health research, we don't know what we want to fund, and so we will work with people in countries to identify what those are. One thing I'd like to kind of maybe point you towards is that even within national institutions or research institutions within developing countries, there's hierarchies. For example, if you were to just go to Chad, let's say, or let me use Kenya because I know Kenya really well. If you went to a university in Kenya and you asked to work with local researchers, the first person you'll meet is an older male. And then you'll have to go through a few layers to meet younger researchers who are, who can provide you much more critical analysis for issues that actually affect them and their generation. And so you need a research strategy that actually engages with the researchers that are behind the curtains, because it's really easy to go to a university and say that you want to work with a group and really just end up working with an older male, an older researcher, and for me, I think, and I understand that younger researchers are the older generations of tomorrow, and so getting to them means that you're building capacity for the future, but you're also designing a process that will at some point also kind of go past them and reach further and reach the younger generations of the 2030s and the 2040s. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Yvonne, did you have anything to add? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what I was thinking has actually been captured, including what Jessica just mentioned about the context being quite diverse. But I would really maybe focus on institutional factors around climate change and health. So for example, if you're looking at the impacts of extreme events, maybe you want to understand what are some of the social and institutional barriers maybe to accessing health, to accessing maybe food and nutrition and wash services for local communities. Of course, the contexts are very different if you're comparing, the dry lands with other areas or urban areas with rural areas. But I think the institutional and social context is really important to investigate to see what some of those barriers might be.
Thank you, Yvonne, and all. And I can see there was a wave of gratitude for those answers, I think, and lots of note-taking, so that's wonderful. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, we have 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Thanks, Janine. Again, if you could please introduce yourself.
I'm Lisa Banda from Malawi. I work with Civil Society Network on Climate Change, CISONIC. So my question is around adaptation as one key thing with regards to achieving sustainable development. I was looking at our long-term development strategies that we've just developed, the Malawi Vision 2063, and unfortunately, just to mention that the phrase climate change only comes in 5 times in the document. So I wanted to understand, how do we ensure that programming is there? We incorporate adaptation in our programming because we want to ensure that we have long-term financing and not project-based. Another thing is, how do we make sure that we ensure that implementation of projects from financing facilities is agile? That is to allow that even when we are having the financing aspect of there is flexibility on what is needed in our various communities that we have. So also I wanted to mention that in the issues of research regarding adaptation, we are still developing our national adaptation plan. We're in that process. So one key document that we developed is the NAB country profile for Malawi, where we identified entry points which can be used, and one thing is development planning cycles. How do we break the gap, or how do we break that vulnerability of politicians giving in projects that are not really climate resilient just because they want to get ahead in the leadership circles? How do we break that gap? Thank you.
So we have a couple of questions there. One is, how do we better incorporate adaptation in our development programming generally? How do we make sure our financing is agile so that it can meet a whole range of different needs? Might need to come back to your third question. I didn't quite catch it, but who would like to respond to any parts of those questions? Did you? Kathy's going.
Was the question can you repeat the first question?
How do we better incorporate adaptation in our
Into
development
our
planning
development
processes?
plans. Oh, I mean, that's really hard. I don't know if I can answer it adequately. I guess it's completely, for a quick response, is that adaptation has to be in line with our development plans. It has to. I mean, we can't. We no longer really think about development in the same way we used to. At least our government, it's completely changed development for us, and so development has to be in line with adaptation. And so I think there's a terminology that we've been using in adaptation: transformative adaptation, transformational adaptation, and I like that a lot because it's not just about adapting to survive, which is like the lowest form of adaptation. Someone was just explaining to me there's like ranges of adaptation, and it's like you just adapt just to survive. That's not what we're doing. There's opportunities within adaptation to adapt to and make it even better, and I remember when someone first explained that to me, I didn't like it because I think it's incredibly unfair that we're being forced to adapt at all, and I didn't want the positive spin to it. But at the end of the day, you know, I think there are opportunities, and that's what we're trying to do with our NAP, is to try to find ways like how, and that's when we talk about with our communities, when we do community consultation, we ask them, what do you envision for your island? What kind of, you know, a positive vision for your island? And they actually sketch and draw what they want to see that's a positive vision. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at adaptation and development in that form, you know, making sure that you adapt and make things better. So I guess I know I'm being a bit repetitive, but I think that's some initial thoughts. Yeah, it's a tough question, yeah.
Thanks, Kathy. Anyone else like to respond, Aro?
I don't know the Malawi context, but I've worked in other parts of Africa a bit. I would say there are a number of things that have to be done simultaneously. The first one is to just accept that we're in deep, deep trouble. And that has to be done politically, and it has to be done by citizenry. And, you know, unfortunately, extreme events are the way that happens. It's a really horrible way that it happens, but that's the first thing that's there. The other thing is an understanding, and again, I don't want to be politically incorrect, but the fact is, if we have a significant 1.5 overshoot, if we go anywhere beyond 2, it's not only our countries and our cities and our islands that are going to be at risk. And we said this in 2014, so I'm sounding very stupid saying this again, because I led the urban chapter there. New York, Paris, London, it's over. The difference between, you know, Cape Town and Dar es Salaam and New York and Paris is 10 years. It doesn't matter how much water you have, how much money you have. It's over. Alexandria, it's over. So it's not only about us. It's also the big centers in the world which control most of the capital and the inequality that are also in deep trouble. If you have to withdraw Manhattan 10 kilometers inside because you're going to have a 2-meter sea level rise, or the same thing is happening in Shanghai, it's not only us. Unfortunately, we're at the cutting edge of that curve. This is a deep systemic problem, and it affects everybody everywhere. So, you know, I mean, that realization is really important. And even though we're not responsible for it, we are certainly responsible for what we can try and do to make our lives better. That's where transformational adaptation is important. That's where the integration of adaptation and development and mitigation. And we may not be responsible for the mitigation, but we really have to, you know, force the hand on this one. I'm sorry if I'm talking very directly about this, but you can't make that happen unless we accept that we're in a deep, deep existential crisis, and it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away.
Yes, I think that is part of the solution, isn't it, really? To be very frank about our current situation, as you say, Aro, and to ensure that we're all understanding at a global level the impacts that will be felt and are being already felt by each and every one of us. So, very powerful words. In terms of anyone want to take the question on how can we make financing more agile, I think if we knew the answer to that, systems might be quite different. We see enormous challenges with our climate financing mechanisms, for example, that are set up to be quite unagile, if that's a word, so quite rigid, for example. But I wonder if there are any reflections from the panellists around how can we make our financing more agile. That was the second part of that question.
I'm going to be very direct again, because I had the unfortunate opportunity of, in the final IPCC plenary approvals, talking about adaptation finance, because I work on adaptation finance. The fact is that climate finance is dramatically, by a factor of 6 to 10, less than what we need to do. And of whatever little climate finance that flows, less than 10% of it is coming for adaptation. So the fact is, there is nothing flowing for adaptation. So, you know, agility is a subsequent question as far as that's concerned. The fact is, like I said earlier, we do not recognize the criticality of where we are at the moment. We're also not willing to kind of accept, and I spoke with the along with the Egyptian Minister of Economic Development Planning yesterday, that the world financial system is highly unequal. And the third thing is, resources will not flow uphill, because the risks of financing intervention in developing countries, especially for critical areas like agriculture and health and water, are so high. We pay, you know, 7, 8, 10, sometimes 10% more than what market rate of interests are like. It is not surprising that investment doesn't flow. Investment in a system, in the world financial system, goes to where returns are assured. So unless we're able to transform the financial system, agility is a downstream process. And there are processes in which developing countries, and we have our own institutions at the moment, are taking serious sort of steps to try and make sure the resources are available. But the fact is, and I'm a realist in this case, it's an unequal system. We have to stand up for ourselves and actually raise our own resources. And the only thing that I could say for the Indo-Pacific region is, this is the center of the global economy. The bulk of the global economy is driven by growth for countries in the region. If we're able to take the savings and investment in those regions and bring it back into the regions, we have a chance of doing something for ourselves. Don't wait for large-scale private sector resources to flow. They will not flow in unless the returns to investment are actually significant. So we've got to bring down the cost of capital. That's going to be a long and difficult battle. It's happening at the moment in the negotiations, but I'll be very sharp and direct on this. Adaptation does not figure in that process. You cannot do this with hundreds of millions of dollars. You need billions of dollars, but those resources will have to come from us first, fine, even though it's unfair, because if we don't look after ourselves, it's not going to happen.
Thanks, Aro. I think Jessica might have had some reflections on that point too, and perhaps Yvonne?
Yeah, I think getting finance to where it's needed in a timely manner requires mechanisms that are fit for purpose. And fit for purpose means that there is kind of an understanding of what the needs and the sources are, like supply and demand. The kind of they have an agreement, but also an understanding on what is needed, but also if you need the finance, you know where to go to get it. And so, for example, we need a mechanism, if there was a mechanism that funded capacity development at the local level, then that mechanism needs to be appropriate for the skills at that level, skills for project development, project implementation, but also designed to make sure that it addresses that capacity development need. Doing that will require kind of creating a point where everyone can meet. And so if we realize that the group that needs finance does not have this expertise to design projects, then there needs to be a mechanism that will enable that group to get that expertise. And so fit for purpose mechanisms is quite important. It enables finance to be directed exactly to where it's needed, but also quicker transfer approaches. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Thanks, Jessica. Did you have anything to add, Yvonne?
Yeah, actually, I won't say much about the financing because I know, at least for us in research, we face a lot of similar issues of how to actually get financing to do the research where it's needed. But the question you asked about how to incorporate adaptation into development priorities, I was thinking about the fact that adaptation needs can be I wouldn't say easy to isolate, but if you look at it from a sector-specific point of view, then you're actually able to really bring out adaptation needs. I'll give you an example when it comes to food security. I don't know about the context in Malawi, but in Kenya, we rely on maize as a staple crop. But with the changes in the variability in climate that's been happening in the past few years, maize is really not doing well in Kenya. So if you look at it from a sector-specific point of view as agriculture and food security, then it's easy to understand that you do need to adapt, for example, the kind of crops that you're growing. So I think that can be one way to think about it. Think about it in terms of agriculture, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of local livelihoods, for example, and then you'll be able to bring out the adaptation more clearly.
Yeah, great points there. So, there are two more questions? One, Kieran, you first? Oh, the mic's next to you. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Kieran McCormick from the Climate Reality Project, the Al Gore organization. I work at the University of Melbourne, co-located with Kathryn and Janine. Thanks so much for all the contributions. It's a broad scope that we're covering. Thanks for the highlighting those intersections with the development priorities and particularly with gender and elevating the voices of youth. So the Climate Reality Project provides training for people from all walks of life, led by Al Gore, but we also can provide a global platform for needed stories from the Global South. I'm wondering if there are particular stories or particular perspectives on this topic that you think need to be heard in the Global North.
Would you like to start, Yvonne?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think one thing that immediately comes to mind for me is that there are a lot of existing projects. Jessica had mentioned this issue of the Global North, Global South collaborations and the need to maybe strengthen the Global South. There are actually quite a lot of initiatives that are either coming from the Global South or are represent collaborations between South-South institutions. So I think that would be a good place to start looking at initiatives like, programs that support women in climate change, for example. I've been part of a fellowship with an institution called the Mawazo Institute, which has provided capacity building and funding to over 40 women PhDs from the African continent. So I think it would be good to highlight some of those stories that are actually coming from the Global South and having real positive impact across sectors, of course, including climate change.
Any other comments? I think the question was really around how we've got a pretty excellent opportunity to link with the Climate Reality Project, I think, as Kieran is saying. So are there any potential areas you think of connection with the areas of work you're currently involved with? Yeah? Okay. Thanks, Kathy.
Actually, okay, I was going to say no, but all of these stories we're talking about, I think, are great opportunities that we've been mentioning so far. But I guess one thing I do want to highlight is, again, going back to the unique vulnerability of atoll nations. The Marshall Islands is in a coalition called the Coalition of Climate Atoll, Coral Atoll Nations, CANCC, and I think that's a coalition between the Maldives, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands. And I think highlighting the ways in which we're each approaching adaptation and how it varies. There's different strategies that we're employing. There's different ways in which we're working together and learning from each other. I think that could be, I would love to just highlight atolls just around, just in general, just a lot more. I think a lot of people don't understand what atolls are and things like that. So, yeah.
Oh, yes, please, Jessica.
Yeah, I make up my own questions. So I'll just answer a question that I thought I heard. I don't think it should be about Global North and the Global South. I think it should be, I use examples. It should be a person from Malawi sharing a lesson with a person from Chad. They are able to connect. They have some level of shared, experiences. We don't need a youth from Kenya speaking to a youth from the UK, at least in my opinion. But in doing so, I think and I think the youth, there's something amazing about being 20 to 25. You're really optimistic. You have very little to lose, at least at that point. There's something transformational that happens at that age, and I think tapping into that age group and actually enabling them to interact, but also ensuring that they have so much in common that they can learn from each other. Another thing is going beyond capital cities, go to places that are beyond, the cities that are easier to reach, so that you can enable transformational actions from much deeper than the centers of countries, and in that case, I think it shows that it enables youth to learn from each other and say that you had this problem, and mostly positive examples, that you had a problem, you spoke to your local area MP and something changed, or you had a problem and then you did it yourself, maybe we could do the same. And it's something I can easily relate to, because you have a river, I have a river, I can do the same, yeah.
Thank you, Jessica. And another question please.
Hello, everyone. Well, Katrina Eichinger from the Hans Seidel Foundation in Germany. And at the beginning, you mentioned that research done in the Global South lacks funding, but all the funding goes to the Global North. So I'd like to know, how would you evaluate joint research projects from the Global North and the Global South? Thank you.
Any takers? Aro?
So let me speak from one of the largest research, Global North, well, largest adaptation research programs that I co-led across 10 countries in Africa and India over 5 years. And the idea was to look at adaptation at scale. It came from the sort of UKRI stable, which was held between us in India and the University of Cape Town in South Africa with 10 other universities. The critical thing, I think, is to recognize that researchers in the Global South are not only embedded, but the knowledges that they bring are actually much more useful, not only for the South, but also for the North. So altering the balance of power within research, having PIs from Southern institutions lead processes, which is sometimes a little problematic for national research foundations to actually think of and manage, and they pull back from that space, I think is very critical. Investing, like we've heard many of our colleagues on the panel speak about, in developing the careers of younger researchers. And I think our greatest success in the ASAR and the CARIA program is actually training about 200 younger researchers, of which more than half are women. And that has changed not only the discourse, it has changed the kind of questions that they're dealing with, it changes methods. That's an extremely powerful way of doing that. And allowing people from different geographies to work across those geographies. You know, even in East Africa, and between East and West Africa, between Southern and you know, whatever it is, to allow the exchange and embedment of active research, you can see the connections that we're talking about here. Because what often is lost in these processes is the common factors, whether it's the climate drivers from the physical science side, the elements of vulnerability, the frames of analysis that really strengthen the engagement that's happening in between. So I would say, you know, most of these really successful programs, and there's a withdrawal for them, have been tremendous capacity development programs for researchers in the North, because they don't necessarily have a sense and the lived experience of the kind of questions that we're talking about in some senses, especially for women researchers. So for independent foundations, to my mind, that's the way to go, especially as national research foundations pull back from that process because of other imperatives. And it works. I can tell you that from personal experience. And it can really do tremendous things for national policy and for national capacity.
Can I agree with that? Yeah. I mean, collaborative research is not new. We've been seeing it for years. I mean, it's as old as probably 20 or 30 years. But any collaborative research between a Global North and Global South institution, the Global North benefits. You see a Global North researcher coming to a country twice or three times, they go back, they're an expert of that country. They're like, you know, I do research in Kenya, and now if you need any Kenya expertise, do ask me. But then the Global South researchers who actually were involved in that work rarely get that recognition. I was speaking to a colleague a few days ago. I really should have asked what that paper was, which I'll mention in a second. I was saying that there's a paper that kind of assessed IPCC citations and found that very few citations in the IPCC had Global South leadership. The first author was a very small number. And then even if you looked further and looked at who are the second, third, fourth, or even 10th authors, even then the numbers were even smaller. And it matters who leads the research. It matters who's the lead author in that research. It doesn't, I mean, we could have a Global North researcher who's a second author, third author, fourth author, but I think it definitely matters who's the lead researcher. And so we need to kind of change this, where lead researchers are Global South authors, they are Global South researchers, and we need resources that actually enable them to do so. But then it's not really about having that research, a paper that is published by a Global South researcher. It's going more than that. It's ensuring that that research actually benefits the author themselves, but also their country. And so it needs to be put in places where it actually feeds back into the places that are of importance for the authors, or a priority for the authors. And I think here is where we note that a research that actually funds a researcher in the global south has much directly research in the global south has a much more positive primary, secondary, and tertiary effect on the researchers in those countries. And so you hire on research assistants, you train them, and you're much more able to create analytical capacity and research capacity in country that may not actually emerge within that, within that year or 2 years, but it goes much further. I mean, I'm one of those people who benefited from research that was, that was funded in a developing country, and so you get that research capacity, and you're much more able to engage in independent research later down the road.
If I can jump in and just add to that. Again, this is my personal opinion, but if you look at the IPCC AR6 reports, the adaptation regional chapters, in my opinion, the best chapter is the Africa chapter. And that's led by two of our colleagues from Africa. Unlike in the past, whether it was Europe or North America, the Africa chapter absolutely has pushed the envelopes and has given us the confidence that we can talk about climate resilient development. It is grounded on African research, and it is a stupendous piece of integration. In fact, the best piece of work on climate finance is actually done by the Africa chapter. The other regions were not able to deal with questions of climate finance that came up earlier, but Africa has done that very effectively. So the world is changing, and I think we should really strengthen that process of change. It's really important. The other just question to people on the funding sort of cycle here, one of the important messages that you can actually bring across is that as far as climate change is concerned, and as far as sustainable development is concerned, most of the countries of the global north are still either developing countries as far as climate is concerned, otherwise you wouldn't have the emissions, or they're underdeveloping. The United States in the Sustainable Development Index is at number 44. It's dropped by 10 points. UK has just experienced a 30% decrease in its per capita income post-Brexit. These are real realities. So development is not something that goes from the north to the south. We're talking about global north and global south. So I think one of the core messages you have to take is that we're all developing countries in some dimension or the other, and certainly on the question of climate. And the quicker we realize that, the quicker that we can learn from indigenous and local experiences from researchers from the south, the better chance that we have of not having a very, very serious problem in the 2050s.
Thank you, Arrow. Thank you all for your comments to that question. So I hope that's provided you with some helpful advice in terms of the programs you might be developing. There's a question at the front there. If you could please introduce yourself.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Abdurrahman, the co-founder of Arab Renewable Energy Academy, which aims to promote the awareness of renewable energy and climate technology, also training and building capacity in MENA region and Arab countries. My question is, we know after every COP, the main outline is to enhance training, building capacity, and enhancing the R&D of climate technologies. Why the majority of financial programs are directed to the implementation of climate technology, while in the other side there are a small percentage is determined or directed to the capacity building and training program. Although the adoption of climate technology in every countries through training, building capacity, co-design the knowledge is very crucial to success the energy transition. Thank you.
So just so I'm clear, was your question around the tension between funding climate technology and funding capacity building, and how we don't see enough attention paid to the funding of capacity building?
There is a huge gap between financial program for implementation of technology and capacity building. Because, for example, in Yemen, country, Yemen. Because of the war, many people find the solar is the only solution to supply their homes, their businesses, solar pumps for electricity. When we look at the market potential, we have around 1,600 megawatt of solar system. In the other side, regarding the training program, financial programs to build the building capacity, there are 2% of this financial program. Why this gap is existing?
Okay, thank you. Anyone like to have a go at this one? Yvonne?
Yeah, one thing I can think of is perhaps in the original design of some of the programs, depending on, and we've talked about this quite a bit in the panel, who's designing the program? Is there an awareness that the capacity needs are actually X and not Y? So I think it goes back to the original design and being able to co-design some of these programs with the local people who are actually impacted and actually doing the work within those areas. So I think it has to start from the very beginning.
Any other comments? Thanks, Yvonne.
You've asked a difficult question, but I'll try and answer it as honestly as I can. The energy industry, which you're talking about, and this also got a link to adaptation, is the largest organized industry in the world at the current point of time. It's been so for the last 150 years. That's coal, oil, and gas. It's currently controlled by maybe 50, maximum 100 companies, including state-owned companies in the world. The largest single sort of IPO in the world was for an energy company from this region. We know that it happened 5 years ago. There is, in a very unequal world, there is no reason for these institutions and sometimes the country governments that are associated with them to give up their power. It's very simple. And to establish, and solar is an example of that, to establish a fab for the fabrication of solar cells is $1 billion operation. And it only happens in low-risk environments in which there's water that's available. So the actual fact is very simple. This is about commercial and economic interests. We talk a lot about equality and transfer of technology, etc. But if you want to transform the system, the good thing about renewables is the unit prices are decreasing. But you will never be, in the current regime, at the center of a production system. I mean, Africa should have, as or sort of the Middle East, as the region which has the most significant amount of solar energy that's available, and you have land, you should be the center where the production, the supply chains actually work. The fact is, and that's true for storage, the fact is that that's not happening because the lithium sits somewhere else, the storage systems and the production systems sit somewhere else. So I'm being a little harsh and being politically incorrect, but the fact is that the commitment to change that system is not an easy one to work, and it hasn't changed for a long time. That's, in a sense, the battle for COP.
Okay, thank you very much for all of those questions. I think I'll pass back over to Janine.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. And I'm going to thank each one of you on the panel, and I'll start off. There's an interest in having all your names, so I'm going to repeat each one. It seems formal, but just so that our audience knows, I want to thank Aromar Revi from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, Kathy, oh my goodness, of course I will mess up your name, right? Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner, Climate Envoy of the Republic of Marshall Islands, of course my colleague Kathryn Bowen, Jessica Omukuti from the University of Oxford. I know my eyesight goes worse. Yvonne Githiora from University of Nairobi. Thank you all for really interesting insight, and it's clear that when we're speaking about adaptation, it is local, it is context specific, And when we're talking about the types of research needs that countries have, it has to be defined from the bottom up. And it's really critical that research needs are funded. It's very critical to open up new fronts for funding, including in the case of capacity development and transfer of technology. It's critical that we work on all fronts. We have to deal with mitigation. We do have to deal with adaptation. We have to find responses for loss and damage. It requires international cooperation. It requires systemic change because right now we don't have an international cooperation system that's fit for purpose. So thank you all, and thank you for your participation.